The Darshan Talks live stream. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products you depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, or obsess over pharmacy, this is a live stream for you. I do have to emphasize that I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. My guest is an attorney, but they're not your attorney. So this is not legal advice. I am a pharmacist, but I'm not your pharmacist. So this is not clinical advice. I do these live streams. I do these interviews because they're a lot of fun. And I find myself learning something new every single time. But it would be great to know if someone's actually listening. So if you like what you hear, please please like, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you want to ask questions, my guest would be happy to answer them. And I'm speaking for him, which I probably shouldn't do, but I expect Absolutely. He'll be happy to answer them. Absolutely. Please leave comments so that we can have that engaging discussion. After the talk or during the talk, please share the video. We would love to have other people hear it, kind of the entire point of this whole thing. I do also want to emphasize that what we're discussing is considerations. They don't necessarily represent or reflect the opinion of the host, the guest, or our employers. If you want to find me, you can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to my website at darshantalks.com. Today's interview is really exciting because I've actually known my guest for several years. Well, the first several years by reputation. Then I actually got a chance to meet him.
I wonder what that was.
It was actually very, very good. It was very, very good. I remember hearing about you, and I was thoroughly impressed. And I met you, and we actually had a long drive together, and I was even more impressed. That was a fun drive. And we landed up having a conversation, and that was a lot of fun. Our guest today is, I want to get my words right. He's a longtime FDA regulatory attorney and is now the chief regulatory counsel at Varian Medical Systems. He's how should I put this? His entrepreneurship has reflected in many of the tools I've used and continue to use, and I found that to be very interesting. And he's been very modest in his description. So if you decide to go to his LinkedIn page, which I will flash right here, you will discover more about him and see how amazing he actually is. And he's been kind enough to actually come on today's talk. So I'm really excited. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today, Michael Swick. Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good there, Darshan. Thanks for having me here.
Of course. So, Mike, I want to hear a little bit more about what. First of all, what does Varian do?
Varian's well, first of all, I do have to caveat. I would like to reiterate that any views I express today are solely mine and not those of my employer or our parent company, Siemens Healthineers. And also that anything I say here is just generally intended to be generally educational and not legal advice. And I can't give clinical advice because I'm not qualified. I'm not a pharmacist, nor am I a doctor, nor did I ever play one on TV.
Did you stay at a Holiday Inn though?
Pardon me? Yeah. So, but as far as Varian, we are the world's leading developer of a product I hope you never need. We are the world's leading developer of the radiation therapies equipment that is to treat cancer. And in addition, we also have a few more collateral products that are used in non-oncology applications, but primarily our mission is to create a world without fear of cancer. So that's Varian.
So that's a really interesting, really broad definition, creating a world without the fear of cancer. It's an interesting statement, though. It didn't say a world without cancer, because that seems like a bit of a reach, but making it easier to deal with.
Absolutely. Again, that's clearly. I don't think anyone has any illusions that cancer, can be eradicated. It's in the DNA essentially. The DNA gone amok. But if you look at what we're trying to do, and in particular, our combination with Siemens, which was announced about over a year ago, and then consummated in mid-April, is the merging of the two company's technologies. They're heavily involved in imaging and other areas that complement Varian's, is to make cancer attackable around the world, to leverage assets not only in the United States but globally. And we have a presence all over the place. So many different ways we're attacking that at Varian and with our parent company Siemens.
Which is really interesting. I mean, I kind of have to ask the first question. I know we had an original goal, and we'll talk about that hopefully, which is how do you prep for a new product launch, and what does that look like from the perspective of a regulatory attorney? But before we go down that path, I have to ask. Varian started off as and I'm going to use the term descriptively, but a smaller company, and is now part of the Siemens conglomerate, which is massive. What is it like in terms of culture change, and how do you adjust for the culture change of being part of a smaller company and then being part of a massive, massive group?
Well, understand we weren't that small to begin with. We were 10,000 employees and over $3.2 billion in revenue. But Siemens, and keep in mind that Siemens is not, there's more than one Siemens. There's Siemens AG, which is the huge company, which is the majority owner, as I understand it, of Siemens Healthineers. Siemens AG is more known for like building hydroelectric plants and things of that sort. Siemens Healthineers was spun out of Siemens AG a few years ago, and they have about 55,000 employees and about, I think, somewhere around 17 billion euros in revenue. So it's a large company merging with a very, very large company, and it's a German company, German-based company. So there's always going to be some challenges, but the integration process has been, I think, very well managed, and there's a real spirit of collaboration between the two companies. We've already seen progress in a number of areas where we've been able to work together to solve our customers' challenges. And our customers are, for the most part, large and small hospitals and clinics that are in Varian's arena that are devoted to treating cancer, but the Siemens technology is not limited to the treatment or the diagnosis of cancer. They're really heavily into imaging, so CTs, MRIs, etc., ultrasound. So that have applications, as you know, throughout the different medical challenges that a patient might face.
So you would know, though, about the challenges because you're involved not just in being an FDA regulatory attorney, but you're actually also involved in the dispute resolution.
Yeah, and that's always an interesting process because by dispute resolution, we things. Every company makes mistakes, or sometimes your customers think you made a mistake, and so you have to try to resolve that. And particularly in the United States, you have to do that, and around the world, you have to do that in a compliant way because there's certain laws, healthcare fraud laws, such as the anti-kickback laws, that you have to make sure that you're compliant with, not giving things away for free. So I work closely with our compliance department, actually, which oversees our dispute process. And it's challenged to sometimes see, well, how did this come about? And even in a large company that's well established, things do happen. So, and we try to fix them in a way that's works for both customer and is consistent with the law.
So what I'm hearing you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing you say is that compliance is often involved in avoiding the problem, but inevitably problems will generally happen. That's just the way problems work.
Oh yeah, and one thing I've always stressed to people is the key thing is everyone's going to make mistakes. An FDA regulated company or any company that's subject to other governmental regulation, the key is, people are fallible. But the key is how do you react to that mistake, and that is the key thing. And you have to be, you have to attack it in a comprehensive way. In the medical device world, we know the CAPA process: corrective action, preventive action. So if you have an issue, that you have to not only investigate it, identify root cause, correct it, and then take action to make sure it doesn't recur. So that model applies whether you're talking about a snafu that happens in the manufacturing line or in distribution or in making a quote. So, one of the things I'll work with is going forward is to make sure the systems are reviewed to ensure that to the extent possible these things that lead to disputes don't recur.
So obviously, when you're talking about international transactions and you're helping people across both in the U.S. or internationally, you're now starting to get into areas like FCPA issues, which is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act issues. You're getting into things like, as you mentioned, the anti-kickback law, which I assume is a lot of the thought processes you're putting into play, which is really the second side, if you will, of compliance. So how do you deal with who I assume is your chief compliance officer? Because I imagine you guys work hand in hand in that process.
We do work collaboratively. It's not always the chief compliance officer, but there's regional compliance officers for like North America, Latin America, the Asia Pacific, et cetera. So I work closely with those folks, there's always a reactive approach, and there's also always the training and systems approach to making sure things don't occur in the first place. So
one of the things that always struck me as unusual or odd about compliance, and I say this as a person who does compliance as similar to you, compliance always goes back, at least from the U.S. perspective, to the guidance from, I think it was DOJ. I can't remember, OIG or DOJ, but one of them put out guidance for life sciences companies, and everyone goes back to that. It was OIG.
Yeah.
And it's a great guidance. But when I read that guidance, the thing that really jumped out at me was this is just the PDCA cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the Deming cycle, if you will. Do you find? I feel like we see that a lot in quality, and people follow that as part of basically what ASQ, the American Society of Quality, recommends. Do you find people sort of overcomplicate the process in compliance or in general, sort of in quality, or because you also manage quality, or do you find that it is being done appropriately overall?
I think it varies from company to company. I mean, there's a challenge in writing processes to make sure that you write them with enough specificity and clarity that they're understandable. But you also need to make sure that they're written in a way that you don't, box yourself into a corner that's not necessary. And that's one of the great challenges. I don't claim to be the world's greatest expert in because I happen to be the son of a editor, and so I have a tendency to see all the little minutia or nuances in how something's written, and so I tend to not overwrite, but make sure that there's a total lack of ambiguity if possible in working with processes. So, but that's that can be. You have to be careful that you balance that with with realities and best practices. So, hold on, for some reason my phone is ringing.
You're okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question, because you've sort of raised the idea here, which is when you're talking about best practices, do you think the goal of an SOP should be to enable someone who walks in to be able to technically just read the SOP, follow the SOP, and do whatever process? Or is the SOP an overriding principle that the work orders or specific work instruction should be able to give more clarity to? Or what is your philosophy around SOPs?
Well, I actually have a sort of a three-prong approach to that. There are policies, that typically are more general than there's SOPs that will be as detailed as possible. But sometimes you actually have to get down, as you mentioned, the work instruction level where you get into very specific granularity. But I do agree that an SOP, in my view, the SOP ought to speak speak on its own. So whether it be or even a more granular work instruction. So someone ought to be able to come in, be trained on it, and not have to go down and ask Jim or Jane, how do I do something? It ought, so it ought to be very capable from, reading and understanding the SOP and then being trained on it. Having all the best SOPs in the world don't do you any good if you don't have training. So, as I may have mentioned to you once before, I actually have a mnemonic on how you ensure
Please,
compliance. Please. Well, it's basically I use please teach risk avoidance comprehensively, vigorously, comprehensively, and corporately. And the please is nothing gets done if you don't have procedures. The teach is train. Yeah, if you don't, you can have all the best procedures in the world. If you don't train on them, they're worthless. R for risk is record keeping. If you don't record it, it didn't happen. Every regulatory agency in the world will tell you, it's not written down, it didn't happen. And then even if it is written down, you have to have good audits. You have to A for avoidance is risk avoidance is you got to audit your processes. You got to review them, either with internal audit teams or occasionally bring in people from the outside to make sure you're doing right. Vigorously in my mnemonic is that you have to validate these things. You have to check to see, do they really work? And corporately and comprehensively refers to the fact that you have to have good communications, encourage good communication so people come to you with problems and aren't punished for that process. And the final C corporately is just basically what it says is you don't have a compliance culture that comes from the top of your organization, and you don't think that can change. I think it's time to get your CV in order and find a different company to work for, because somewhere along the line that company will have a major issue. And I can tell you that I've seen it different things in different companies. I was once general counsel of a generic drug company, and I was brought in after the generic drug scandal in the late 80s to help clean up a company, and the corporate culture of that company was rotten from the top. So on the other hand, I at my current company, shortly after I came in here, we were looking at a situation where we might need to do a recall, and I remember one of the senior executives basically saying, "We've got to do what's best for the patient," which meant that there was no question that we were going to do a recall. And I said, "That's what I like to hear." And a company like Varian's been around for over 70 years because of that type of approach. Which is not to say we never have a problem, but we know how to address it. So
I think that's amazing. I think that's awesome because my experience sort of matches yours in that you often have to fight a client on things like recalls because to them they see a loss of value, a loss of actual cost. Meanwhile, there's a bigger picture at play, and the most common, and it's funny, this is the third time it's come up in like a week, but the Tylenol scandal from the 1980s is a great example of how you do a recall right. No one asked them to, but J&J went out and pulled everything off the shelves.
Yeah, that's the classic. That's the classic model in any crisis management course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a little bit about. So you're talking about having these good management practices, and you talk about having a strong corporate body that supports quality, that supports compliance, and as you put it quite literally, looks out for the patient. As part of that process, what is the way in which you as a regulatory attorney, you as a compliance professional, go out and get teams ready to actually start bringing your product to market? Are you involved in the clinical research phase? Are you involved in the promotional phase, medical affairs? Which of these are you involved in? How does that play out for you?
Well, I'm involved in a lot of them actually, because so let's take about it and look at it from a couple of different angles. First of all, most of our products that Varian has launched over the years are 510K products, so they typically don't require any clinical studies, and so we'll go to market off a determination of substantial equivalence. We could talk a little bit about what's involved in how that gets launched from a promotional perspective. I mean, in the ideal world, and we've incorporated this into our systems, is that the claims that you want to make about your product need to be looked at early on in the design control process, so that you don't get to the end of the day, the end of the process, you're about to launch the product, and people want to say, "Oh, I want to say we're better than X," or something like that, and then your PRC team, like me and regulatory folks, say, well, where's your substantiation? Well, we know it's better. So that's not substantiation.
Right. Right.
Because most medical devices, a lot of people don't realize this, are also subject to the Federal Trade Commission standards on substantiation, because the FTC has jurisdiction over most medical devices. FDA does not technically have jurisdiction over the advertising of anything other than what's called a restricted device, which are basically PMA devices that require pre-market approval application. So your 510K device, with certain very limited exceptions, is not subject to FDA's jurisdiction for advertising. Although, don't forsake, however, FDA views practically everything they want to as labeling. So they do have jurisdiction over your labeling. But the FTC standard on making, for instance, comparative claims often could come, if they're a health-related claim, could come down. You have to have head-to-head clinical trials. So if you're going to be making claims about your products, you need to look at those very early in the development process and plan for that in how you are going to, what kind of data you're going to generate. So that's something we at Varian are, we're baking that into the system, so that you don't come to the end of the day and say, oh, well, how do we prove this? Well, we want to launch and say this. Well, sorry, you can't say that. So that's a key aspect. And then, there's the more mundane aspects of any launch, is that just, 60 to 90 days beforehand, you get a lot of material that comes in that you got to review with care. And so we, work with the product teams on that. Did a similar thing when I was the chief regulatory counsel at Illumina. So I hope that partially answers your question.
It does. I guess the question I have that goes along with it is, a lot of companies divide PRC review into advertising review, and then medical affairs does their own review. What is your opinion on something like that? The idea that one is advertising, so we need full-blown PRC. One is scientific discussion, so we're going to primarily have medical look at it, and we'll call in other experts as necessary. But what is your take overall?
Well, there's sort of my favorite phrase, or my infamous phrase, is the devil's in the details. So, scientific exchange is a recognized sort of, for lack of a better term, safe harbor that medical affairs will take advantage of. But simply because it's in medical affairs, for example, doesn't necessarily mean you can affirmatively talk off label. There's, in some companies, I think there's a misunderstanding of that issue. I've seen it done multiple ways, but the two companies I've been primarily involved with, most of that will end up in PRC, as opposed to being solely under the purview of medical affairs. There are occasionally some things like just scholarly articles that we have a separate committee called a Medical Affairs Review Committee.
So talk to me a little bit about that, the Medical Affairs Review Committee. How is that different? What is the impact? And how is it different? Why does it matter? Why is it different enough?
Well, it's because most of those types of things are not. They're very scientifically oriented. They're not promotional pieces. They're discussing sort of maybe some an investigator-initiated clinical trial or something that was done under a research grant. So they are scholarly papers, and they're not designed to be, to promote a product per se. And they require a review of medical experts and how they're, in their review. I mean, as I've been around a long time, but there's certain things I'm not qualified to review. As good a reviewer as I might be. if you want to talk about genetic sequencing or the dynamics of radiation therapy, I've learned a lot, but it's you're going to need someone with a more scientific medical background for those types of reviews. So.
But you don't worry about the types of claims being made in those because you don't think that they
well, typically they're not making claims. They're in the overt sense of the word. They're discussing a scientific exercise and providing a balanced review of what happened. If they were at the end of the article to say something like, "And this proves that we're better than X,"
right.
then or that this proves that that you can use this to treat a new indication, then I would be concerned. But that's not been an issue that I've had to face. So.
Fair enough. But now we're reaching this world where we're talking about how should we put this? As you know, with Europe, they're now asking for patient-centric, patient lay language summaries, if you will. And you've got the US FDA all about talking about patient centricity. So you look at ICMJ, and they say that if we're going to publish something, they want a version that patients can understand as well. How do you start drawing that distinction? Is that still scientific exchange, or is that now not scientific exchange anymore because the audience isn't a scientist?
Well, I think if you're starting writing for the patient, you have to be very careful on how you approach that. I mean, and keep in mind that writing clearly for a patient is incredibly difficult because the standard is something like an 8th grade education, if not lower than that. And, it's really difficult to write to that level. That's, an issue. I think it's emerging, and I'll have to, pass on, I don't have any distinct, I haven't had to deal with that issue yet here at Varian or before at Illumina. So, or
Fair
while
enough.
in private practice. So,
I'm going to ask one last question before we
good
ask.
Question.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question before we sort of move away and ask the sort of closing questions that I always do. You talk about PRC review. And this is something that the FDA, as you know, has been spending more and more time looking at nowadays, which is influencer marketing. And between the FTC and the FDA, there are questions as to how that's happening. I don't know if you face this, whether in private practice, whether at Illumina, whether at Varian, where you are. But do you have any thoughts about influencer marketing and how PRC and MLR can sort of look at it to ensure compliance? Any tips, if you will?
Well, I have personally, I haven't had to deal with it because I think influencer marketing for very sophisticated gene sequencing equipment, such as Illumina markets or the types of products we sell, you're not going to have, just celebrity X out there saying, "Oh, you want to use this one," or "I had great results with this, cured my cancer." That doesn't have any credibility. So it's not an issue that I've had to focus on. However, I do think it's a very valid issue. Because depending on your average consumer out there, they run the gamut on how gullible they might be, or how impressed they might be by someone of note has notoriety, whether positive or negative notoriety. I think it's something that does require significant attention, but fortunately, it's not been a headache I've had to worry about.
Fair enough. As you know, I usually aim for these to be about 15, 20 minutes. You are unfortunately far too interesting for 15, 20 minutes. We're at 29 minutes. So I do need to start asking you questions to close up. But the first question I always ask, just so everyone's aware, is how can people contact you? And you've been kind enough to provide your LinkedIn, and people might reach out to you on that. So thank you for that.
Also, I didn't mention that, but I'm also on Twitter at I'm FDA Counsel on Twitter. That's my handle.
FDA Counsel. Perfect. Thank you. My question for you now is, what is something you'd like to ask the audience?
I guess as a regulatory lawyer, I'm compliance and quality emphasis is, what's your major fear from FDA these days? or your regulatory authority if you're outside the United States?
So I usually try to answer it in general. I think so you at least have one answer, one point, one data point, one datum, if you will. My general fear right now is the FDA is so focused on COVID. What is their bandwidth right now for other approvals and other enforcement? It seems like everything's taken a little bit of a back seat. So I know that they have tremendous amounts of both money and power, but can they use that right now in a way that allows you to address the needs of COVID, but also address the other patient needs? So that's my personal thought.
I think that's a good point. We also see that spill over just in the entire healthcare community in general. But
Exactly.
and you're seeing that this month. If you look at the NFL broadcasts, they are reminding you that just because COVID's out there, don't forget about cancer. Don't avoid the screening for that. And we saw at our customers that there was a real inability for patients to get screened or treated, and what was continued to be done was actually somewhat miraculous as to keeping systems going by our teams, and also hats off to the healthcare providers for everything they did during that time and continue to do.
Exactly. Here's my next question. What's something you've learned in the last month?
In the last month, what have I learned? This may sound really silly, but I have a 9-year-old Weimaraner, and she likes to curl up, and she looks like one of those roly-poly bugs when she does. And I found out that I always called them a potato bug, but they're actually technically probably a pill bug, and they're from a whole. They're part of the sort of the whole arthropod species. So I learned a little bit about pill bugs.
There you go. Did not even know there was such a thing as a pill bug. Just learned something new right there.
Yeah.
Next question. Tell us one unique thing about yourself.
One unique thing about myself, or that happened. Well, I'll tell something that happened to me.
Sure.
My
Why not?
senior year in college, I became very infamous because I won not one but 2 raffles that they held. The first being a car, and the second one being an all expenses paid trip for 2 to Bermuda for 6 days. So I was the most hated person on the Bowdoin College campus. So,
that is,
and I'll take that hate all the way to the bank.
I love it. I have to imagine you have to have gone, damn it, I wish I'd have just played the lottery. That would have been simpler.
The joke after was there was going to be a third raffle, which I wasn't able to participate in, which was be an all expenses paid trip for 2 with Michael Switt to Las Vegas. So.
There you go. And I have to imagine that the ladies would have loved you for it. So good for you.
I'm not sure. I was seeing some at the time, so it wasn't something I could leverage.
Sorry about that. Well, she must have been very happy. Here's another question. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
That's really easily. Our dog had a very large mammary tumor. Looked like a softball hanging from her chest.
Oh, wow.
And we had surgery removed about 3 weeks ago. Got the path report about a week ago, and all clear. No cancer. So
I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah. So she's snoring in the background.
That's awesome. I love it. My dog's he's out there right now. It was wonderful having you, Mike. Thank you so much again for coming on, and I do hope you'd consider coming back again.
Oh, I'd be happy to. We have other things we can talk about.
You're a wealth of information. It'll be great to have you on again. Thank you again for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Darshan. Be well and stay safe.